The monitor in bed 4 of the cardiac observation unit was showing a resting heart rate of 72 beats per minute, a blood pressure of 118/76, a respiratory rate of 14, and an oxygen saturation of 98% when I arrived to calibrate it at 1:40 a.m. on a Thursday in March. These are normal vitals. They are, in fact, textbook normal. The kind of numbers you'd put on a slide in a training presentation as an example of a healthy adult at rest. The problem was that bed 4 was empty. The sheets were pulled tight in a fresh make. The pillow was undented. The bedside table was bare. And the 5 lead ECG cables were coiled on top of the mattress, disconnected, not attached to anyone. The monitor was reading vitals for a patient who was not there. I need to explain what I do, so the rest of this makes sense. I am a clinical engineer at Mercy Hinfield Medical Center, which is a large university-affiliated hospital on the east side of the city. The campus has 4 main buildings. The original hospital built in 1953, a surgical pavilion added in 1978, a diagnostic wing from 1994, and a patient tower completed in 2011, all connected by corridors at the ground level and by a tunnel system in the basement. I've worked here for 7 years. My title is Biomedical Equipment Technician 2, which means I maintain, repair, and calibrate the hospital's medical devices, patient monitors, infusion pumps, ventilators, defibrillators, surgical equipment, imaging systems, anything with a circuit board and a clinical function. I work the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., because most calibration and preventive maintenance has to happen when the equipment isn't actively in use, which means nights. There are 2 of us on the overnight biomedical team, me and Luisa Ferraro, who covers the surgical pavilion and diagnostic wing, while I cover the original hospital and the patient tower. We share an office in the basement of the original building next to the central equipment depot, and we communicate by phone and by the hospital's work order system. The cardiac observation unit is on the 3rd floor of the patient tower. It has 12 beds in single occupancy rooms arranged along a corridor with a central nursing station, a medication room, and a supply alcove. Each bed has a Philips IntelliVue MX800 patient monitor, a high-end system that tracks ECG, blood pressure, pulse oximetry, respiration, and temperature, and sends all data wirelessly to the central station and to the hospital's electronic medical record system. These monitors are reliable. They're the industry standard for acute cardiac care. I've serviced hundreds of them. They don't generate phantom data. When a monitor isn't connected to a patient, when the leads are disconnected, the cuff is off, the pulse ox probe is hanging, it shows flat lines or a leads off error message. It does not show a heart rate of 72. It does not show blood pressure. It does not invent a patient. I stood in the doorway of room 4 and looked at the monitor. The waveforms were running in real time. The ECG showed a clean sinus rhythm. The plethysmograph wave was cycling normally. The respiratory waveform was smooth and regular. Everything about the display indicated that the monitor was connected to a living, breathing human being whose heart was beating and whose lungs were working and whose blood was circulating oxygenated hemoglobin at a normal rate. I walked to the bed and picked up the ECG cables. They were coiled on the mattress. All 5 leads, snap connectors, empty, not attached to anything. The blood pressure cuff was hanging from its hook on the side of the monitor, deflated, not on an arm. The pulse oximeter probe was clipped to the rail, not on a finger. Nothing was connected. The monitor should have been showing error states across every parameter. Instead, it was showing perfect vitals. I did what any competent technician would do. I assumed the monitor was malfunctioning and I began troubleshooting. I cycled the power, turned it off, waited 30 seconds, turned it back on. It booted normally, ran through its self-test, and within 10 seconds of the self-test completing, the vitals appeared again. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298, the same numbers exactly. I disconnected the ECG cable from the monitor entirely, removing the trunk cable from the port. The ECG waveform went flat and the leads-off alarm triggered. Normal behavior. I reconnected the cable. The waveform returned. Clean sinus rhythm, 72 beats per minute. With the leads connected to nothing. I ran the built-in diagnostic. The monitor reported all channels functioning within specifications. No faults, no errors, no out-of-range values on any internal sensor. The device thought it was working correctly because, as far as its own systems could determine, it was working correctly. It was receiving data on all channels, and the data was clinically valid. The fact that the data was coming from an empty bed was not something the monitor's diagnostics could detect, because the monitor doesn't know what's in the bed. It only knows what its sensors report. I swapped the ECG cable with one from an unused monitor in the supply room. Same result. Clean waveform, 72 BPM. I swapped the pulse oximeter probe. Same result. 98% saturation. I swapped the entire monitor, wheeled in a replacement unit from the depot, connected it to the same cables, and powered it on. The replacement monitor showed the same vitals, the same numbers. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298, two different monitors, connected to empty leads, both reading the same patient. That's when I stopped troubleshooting and started thinking about what I was seeing. Equipment malfunctions produce noise, random values, erratic waveforms, inconsistent data. They don't produce stable, clinically coherent vital signs that replicate across multiple devices. Whatever was generating this data wasn't a fault in the equipment. The equipment was detecting something. It was doing its job. The question was what it was detecting. I checked the central nursing station. The unit clerk, Nina, was there. She told me beds 1, 2, 6, 7, 9, and 11 were occupied with patients. Beds 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, and 12 were empty. I looked at the central monitoring display, which aggregates data from all 12 rooms. Beds 1, 2, 6, 7, 9, and 11 showed their patients' vitals. Varying numbers, some elevated, some abnormal, consistent with actual cardiac patients being monitored in a hospital. Bed 4 showed heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298, clean, stable, textbook. On the central display, bed 4 looked like the healthiest patient on the unit. I asked Nina if she'd noticed. She said she had, about an hour ago, and assumed we'd put a test patient on the monitor during calibration. I said I hadn't, and asked if anyone else had been in room 4. She said no. The room had been empty since the previous morning when the patient in that bed was discharged. I asked who the patient had been. She looked it up. A 78-year-old man admitted for atrial fibrillation monitoring, discharged at 11 a.m. with a normal sinus rhythm. His resting heart rate at discharge was documented at 68 BPM. Not 72, close but not the same. The monitor wasn't replaying the previous patient's data. It was generating new data. I wrote a work order for the monitor in bed 4 Phantom vital signs displaying on disconnected leads. Replicated on replacement unit. No equipment fault identified. Recommend further investigation. And moved on with my calibration schedule. I had 11 other rooms to check on that unit and 2 more units to cover before the end of my shift. I made a note in my personal log, which I keep on my phone. COU bed 4, phantom vitals, no leads attached, data consistent, across device swap. Not a malfunction. Don't know what this is. The next night, Friday, I went to bed 4 first. The room was still empty. The monitor was still showing vitals. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPEO 298, identical to the previous night. I stood in the room and watched the waveforms for about 5 minutes. They were perfect. Not just normal, perfect. Real cardiac waveforms have minor variations in rhythm, amplitude, and morphology. Beat-to-beat intervals fluctuate slightly. Respiratory rates drift. Blood pressure readings change by a few points over time. These waveforms were stable in a way that real physiology isn't. The heart rate was exactly 72 for the entire 5 minutes I watched. Not 71, not 73. 72. The SpO2 didn't waver from 98. Real patients' oxygen saturation fluctuates 97, 99, 98, 97. This didn't move. It was like watching a simulation, except the equipment wasn't in simulation mode. I checked. It was in normal clinical monitoring mode, receiving what it interpreted as live patient data. I reported it to Louisa during our handoff notes. She's more experienced than I am. 15 years in clinical engineering, worked at 2 other hospitals before Mercy Henfield. I described what I was seeing and asked if she'd ever encountered anything like it. She hadn't. She said phantom data usually manifests as artifact, electrical interference, crosstalk between adjacent channels, ground loop noise. It doesn't present as clinically coherent vital signs. She suggested the hospital's wireless network might be routing data from another bed to the bed 4 monitor through a configuration error. That was a good hypothesis. The IntelliView system uses a dedicated wireless network to transmit data between bedside monitors and the central station. And a misconfigured network could theoretically route one bed's data to another bed's display. I spent the rest of that shift checking network configurations. Every monitor on the unit was correctly assigned to its own bed. There were no routing errors. The data appearing on bed 4's monitor was not coming from any other monitor on the network. I checked the network traffic logs. Bed 4's monitor was not receiving data packets from any external source. According to the network, the monitor was generating the data locally from its own sensors, which were connected to nothing. Over the weekend, I was off duty. When I came back on Monday night, March 11th, I checked the cardiac observation unit as soon as I arrived. Bed 4 was occupied. A real patient, a 52-year-old woman, admitted for post-operative cardiac monitoring. Her vitals were on the monitor. Heart rate 88, blood pressure 134/80, respiration 18, SPEO 296, normal for a post-surgical cardiac patient. The phantom vitals were gone, replaced by real data from a real person. I felt relief and also something like doubt, the kind of doubt where you wonder if you made too much of something. If maybe the equipment was glitching after all and the consistency of the numbers was just a coincidence. Then I checked bed 8. Bed 8 was empty. Bed 8's monitor was showing a heart rate of 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPECIFO 298. The same numbers, the exact same numbers to the digit that bed 4 had been showing, I went to bed 8 and looked. Empty bed, fresh sheets, coiled leads, disconnected cuff, probe on the rail. The monitor was reading textbook perfect vitals for a patient who wasn't there. I swapped the monitor. The replacement showed the same data. I checked the network configuration. Correct. I ran the diagnostic. No faults. The phantom had moved. Bed 4 was occupied with a real patient, and the phantom data had shifted to bed 8, which was empty, as if whatever the equipment was detecting had relocated to the next available empty bed. I checked every empty bed on the unit. Beds 3, 5, 10, and 12 were also empty that night. Their monitors were dark, powered on, but showing leads off across all parameters, which is normal for beds without patients. Only bed 8 was showing the phantom vitals. Only one empty bed at a time. I wrote this down. On Tuesday night, bed 8 was occupied with a new admission. Bed 5 was empty and showing the phantom vitals. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298. On Wednesday, bed 5 got a patient. Bed 3 picked up the phantom. Thursday, bed 3 was filled. Bed 10. Friday, bed 10 was filled. Bed 12. The phantom moved through the empty beds like a patient being transferred from room to room, always occupying exactly one bed, always the same vitals, always moving to the next available space when its current bed was assigned to a real person. I documented all of this. I have dates, bed numbers, times, screenshots of the central monitoring display, and network traffic logs for each instance. The documentation is in my personal files and in the hospital's work order system under ticket number BME 2024-0847. I brought it to my supervisor, Tom Andrada, on March 18. He reviewed the work orders and the screenshots. He said it was probably a software bug in the IntelliView system, and he'd open a case with Philips. He opened the case. The Philips field service engineer came on March 22nd, spent 4 hours on the unit, tested every monitor, checked the network, reviewed the central station software, and filed a report that said the system was functioning within specifications. No bugs, no data routing errors, no known issue matching this behavior pattern. The engineer told Tom he'd escalate it to the product engineering team, but he also said, off the record, that in 18 years of servicing IntelliView systems, he'd never seen a monitor display vitals without a connected patient. He said the hardware physically can't do it. The ECG channel requires an electrical signal from a lead in contact with tissue. No contact, no signal, no waveform. What I was seeing should not be possible. But it was possible because it was happening, and it continued to happen every night after the Philips engineer left. The phantom occupied one empty bed on the cardiac observation unit. Always the same vitals, always moving when its bed was filled with a real patient. And I continued to document it, and I continued to mention it in my shift reports. And the responses ranged from Tom saying he was waiting on Philips to the nursing staff saying they'd stopped paying attention to it because the data wasn't attached to a real patient chart and therefore didn't affect clinical care. The phantom vitals existed in a system limbo, visible on the monitors, present on the central display, but linked to no patient record, no medical record number, no name. The nurses learned to ignore the extra set of vitals on their screen the way you learn to ignore a persistent notification on your phone. It was there. It didn't seem to matter. They moved on. I didn't move on because I'm the one responsible for the equipment, and the equipment was doing something it shouldn't be able to do, and no one could tell me why. On April 3rd, the Phantom appeared on a second unit. I was doing routine calibrations on the 5th floor, the general medicine ward, a 40-bed unit in the original hospital building, older equipment, a mix of Philips and GE monitors. Bed 22 was empty. Its monitor, a GE Carescape B650, an entirely different manufacturer, different hardware platform, different software, different network, was showing a heart rate of 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298, the same numbers, the same patient, on a different brand of monitor, on a different floor, in a different building, on a different network explanation I had. A software bug specific to the Philips IntelliView system could not manifest on a GE Carescape. A network routing error on the cardiac unit's wireless infrastructure could not affect a hardwired GE monitor on a separate floor's separate network. Crosstalk between devices requires them to be on the same circuit, in the same vicinity, using the same communication protocol. These two systems share nothing except the hospital's EMR system, and the Phantom data wasn't in the EMR. It existed only on the bedside monitors and the local central stations. Whatever was generating these readings was not a property of any specific piece of equipment. It was a property of the beds, or the rooms, or the hospital. I called Louisa at 2 a.m. She was on the other side of the campus, in the surgical pavilion. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd check something. She called me back 10 minutes later, post-anesthesia care unit, bed 7, empty, a Draeger Infinity Delta monitor, a third manufacturer, a third platform, showing heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, SPO 298, 3 monitors, 3 manufacturers, 3 different buildings, 3 different networks. The same patient. We met in our office in the basement at 3 a.m. Louisa brought the data from the PACU monitor. I brought the data from general medicine and my ongoing documentation from the cardiac observation unit. We compared everything. The numbers were identical across all 3 locations. The waveform morphology, the shape of the ECG, the contour of the plethysmograph wave was identical. We overlaid screenshots from the 3 monitors, and they matched exactly to the pixel, which shouldn't be possible because different manufacturers use different display algorithms to render the same physiological data. A Philips ECG waveform and a GE ECG waveform and a Draeger ECG waveform, even if recording the same patient simultaneously, will look slightly different because the software processes the signal differently. These were identical, not similar. Identical, as if all 3 monitors were displaying the same rendered output from the same source. And that source was not the hardware or the software or the network, but something else. Louisa asked me what the readings reminded me of. I said they reminded me of a simulation, the kind of signal you get from a patient simulator during training, a standardized signal designed to be perfectly consistent. She said that was what she thought too. She asked where the hospital's patient simulators were stored. I said there were 2, one in the nursing education lab on the 2nd floor, one in a simulation center in the basement of the surgical pavilion. She asked if they could be broadcasting. I said no. Patient simulators are self-contained devices that connect directly to monitors via cables. They don't broadcast wirelessly. And even if they did, they couldn't broadcast to 3 different systems on 3 different manufacturer-specific protocols simultaneously. She said she wanted to check something else. She pulled up the EMR system and searched for historical admissions to the 3 beds currently showing phantom vitals. Bed 4 on cardiac, bed 22 on general medicine, bed 7 in the PACU. She filtered for patients who had died in those beds. Cardiac bed 4 had 4 recorded deaths in the past 10 years. General medicine bed 22 had 11, higher census, longer history. PACU bed 7 had 2. Louisa pulled up the most recent death record for each bed and compared the patient's last recorded vital signs to the phantom vitals. Cardiac bed 4, most recent death, a 63-year-old man, March 2023. Cardiac arrest, last recorded vitals before death, heart rate 48, blood pressure 82/50ths, spell 271, not a match. General medicine bed 22, most recent death, an 84-year-old woman, January 2024. Respiratory failure, last vitals, heart rate 110, blood pressure 90/58ths, SPO 284, not a match. PACU bed 7, most recent death, a 45-year-old man, November 2023, post-surgical hemorrhage. Last vitals, heart rate 132, blood pressure 64/40ths, SPO 278, not a match. The phantom vitals didn't correspond to any former patient's data. They were not replaying a death. They were not echoing a previous occupant. They were independent, a set of stable, healthy, textbook-perfect vitals being presented by medical equipment to anyone who looked, in beds where no one lay. And they were spreading. Over the next 2 weeks, the count rose. By April 10th, Louisa and I had documented phantom readings on 9 monitors across 5 units: cardiac observation, general medicine, PACU, the medical ICU on the 7th floor, and the long-term care ward on the 2nd floor of the original building. Each phantom occupied 1 empty bed per unit. Each showed the same vitals. The numbers never changed. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 118/76, respiration 14, spello 298. We started calling it the patient between ourselves, not because we believed there was a patient, but because we needed a shorthand, and the phantom data anomaly across multiple equipment platforms and clinical units was too long for a 3 a.m. conversation. On April 14th, the patient's vitals changed for the first time. The heart rate on the cardiac observation unit phantom dropped from 72 to 68. Not suddenly. It decreased gradually over about 20 minutes, the way a real heart rate decreases when a person falls asleep. I watched it happen on the central monitoring display. At the same time, the respiratory rate dropped from 14 to 12. The blood pressure eased to 112/70ths. The SPO 2 held at 98. The patient was falling asleep. That was the clinical picture these numbers painted. A healthy adult transitioning from wakeful rest to sleep, autonomic tone shifting, respiratory rate slowing, heart rate decreasing. I checked the other units. All the phantoms showed the same change. Simultaneously, every empty bed with phantom data across 5 units showed the same gradual shift towards sleep physiology at the same time. The patient, singular, was falling asleep, and every monitor in the hospital that was tracking it registered the change. I sat at the central station and watched. Over the next hour, the vitals settled into a stable sleep pattern. Heart rate 66, blood pressure 108/68ths, respiration 11, SPO 298. They held there until about 5:30 a.m., when they gradually returned to the baseline waking values. The patient woke up. Whoever or whatever this was, it had a sleep-wake cycle that roughly corresponded to the nighttime hours. It slept from about 2 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. and was awake for the rest of the time the monitors could detect it, which, I realized, was the same window during which I had always observed the phantom vitals. From around midnight, when I started my calibration rounds, to around 6 a.m. when my shift ended and the day staff took over, I didn't know if the readings were present during the day because the daytime engineers didn't check empty beds and the nursing staff had stopped looking. I asked Nina at the cardiac observation unit to watch for the readings during the day shift. She checked and reported back. During the day, the empty beds showed normal leads off status. No phantom vitals. The readings appeared sometime in the late evening and disappeared sometime in the early morning. They were nocturnal. The patient existed at night. On April 17th, I was calibrating an infusion pump in the medical ICU when an alarm sounded. The alarm was from bed 3, which I knew was empty because I'd checked the census board when I came in. I looked at the central display. Bed 3 was showing the phantom vitals. The patient had occupied that bed that night, but the heart rate was 45 and dropping. Blood pressure, 88/54. SpO2, 92. The respiratory rate was 8. The monitor was alarming because the vitals had crossed threshold parameters: bradycardia, hypotension, desaturation. The patient was in distress. The alarms were the standard clinical alarms that trigger when a patient's condition deteriorates. The same alarms that, during the day, would bring a nurse running to the bedside to assess and intervene. At 2:30 a.m., in a 7-bed ICU with 4 nurses and 2 occupied beds at the other end of the unit, the alarm brought Rachel Dow, the charge nurse, to bed 3. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the empty bed. She looked at me. She asked what was going on. I told her the monitor was showing phantom data and had been for weeks. She said she was aware of the phantom data. It was annoying but harmless. She'd been ignoring it. But this was different. The data showed a patient in distress. The alarms were clinical alarms. She was a critical care nurse with 12 years of experience, and every fiber of her training was telling her that a patient was decompensating in front of her, and she needed to act. I could see it in her face. The conflict between what she could see, an empty bed, and what the equipment was telling her, a patient whose heart rate was now 41 and whose oxygen saturation was 89 and falling. She silenced the alarm. She looked at the monitor for another few seconds. The heart rate was 38. She said, "I can't code an empty bed." She walked back to the nurse's station. The alarm triggered again. Heart rate, 34. SpO, 285. Blood pressure, 72/40. The waveforms were deteriorating. The ECG showed widening QRS complexes. The plethysmograph wave was dampening. The respiratory waveform was becoming irregular. I was watching a patient die on a monitor. Every parameter was collapsing in a clinically consistent pattern that I recognized from my training. End-stage cardiovascular collapse. The numbers weren't random. They weren't glitching. They were telling a coherent clinical narrative of a human body shutting down. Heart rate, 28. SpO 281. The monitor alarmed again. This time the red alarm, the critical alarm, the one that in a real scenario means call a code. Start CPR. Get the crash cart. Rachel came back. 2 other nurses came with her. They stood around an empty bed and watched a monitor display a dying patient's vital signs. And no one moved because there was no one to help. The alarms were screaming. The numbers were falling. Heart rate 22. SpO 276. Blood pressure unreadable. And then, at 2:47 a.m., the ECG waveform went to asystole, a flat line. and the monitor displayed the message it displays when a patient's heart stops. HR0, ASY stole. The SpO2 dropped to 0. The respiratory rate went to 0. The alarm changed to the continuous tone. That means cardiac arrest. Rachel turned off the monitor. The room went quiet. We stood there, me, Rachel, 2 other nurses, in an empty room around an empty bed with a silenced monitor that had just shown us a patient die. No one spoke for about 30 seconds. Then Rachel said she was going to file an incident report about the equipment malfunction and walked out. The other nurses followed. I was alone in the room with the monitor and the empty bed and the flat line. I turned the monitor back on. It booted, ran its self-test, and the display came up. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 118/76. Respiration 14. SpO 298. The patient was back, stable, resting, as if nothing had happened. I checked the other units. Louisa checked hers. Every phantom across the hospital had done the same thing at the same time. At approximately 2:30 a.m., all phantom vitals began declining. At approximately 2:47 a.m., all phantom vitals went to 0. At approximately 2:50 a.m., all phantom vitals returned to baseline. The patient had died and come back simultaneously on every monitor in the hospital. And the timestamp, 2:47 a.m., rang something in my memory that I couldn't place. I went to our office and checked the hospital's incident logs. On September 14, 2019, a patient in the medical ICU had been pronounced dead at 2:47 a.m. A code blue had been called at 2:31 a.m. Time of death, 2:47 a.m. The patient was a 61-year-old man named Bernard Kohler. He had been in the ICU for 8 days following a massive myocardial infarction. His resting heart rate, recorded on admission before the infarction, was 72 beats per minute. I felt a specific kind of cold when I read that. Not the metaphorical cold of fear, a physical cold, a drop in the ambient temperature of the basement office that I noticed because I'd been sitting there for 20 minutes and had been comfortable, and now I wasn't. I checked the thermostat. It read 64 degrees. It should have been 68. I don't know if that's related. I'm including it because I document everything now. Bernard Kohler died in the medical ICU on September 14th, 2019 at 2:47 a.m. of cardiac arrest following myocardial infarction. His pre-admission resting heart rate was 72 BPM. His last recorded blood pressure before the infarction was 118/76. I pulled his full chart from the archive. Respiratory rate on admission, 14. SpO2 on admission, 98%. The phantom vitals, the numbers that had been appearing on monitors across the hospital for weeks, were Bernard Kohler's admission vitals. Not his death vitals, his healthy vitals, the vitals he'd had before he got sick. The monitors were displaying Bernard Kohler as he had been before he came to the hospital to die. I don't know what to do with this. I've told Tom, I've told Louisa, I've shown them the numbers, the chart, the match. Tom said it was a coincidence that 72, 118/76, 1498 are common numbers, and the match to a specific patient was statistically meaningless. Louisa didn't say anything. She looked at the data for a long time, and then she said she was going to check something, and she went to the surgical pavilion and came back an hour later and told me that the phantom in the PACU had started, showing a second set of vitals on a second empty bed. Heart rate 80. Blood pressure 126/80 seconds. Respiration 16. Spello 297. Different numbers. Still textbook healthy. She pulled the historical records for the PACU. A patient had died in bed 9 on June 2nd, 2021. A 37-year-old woman. Post-surgical complication. Admission vitals. Heart rate 80. Blood pressure 126/80 seconds. Respiration 16. SPO 297. 2 patients. 2 sets of healthy vitals. 2 people who had died in this hospital and whose pre-illness vital signs were now being displayed by medical equipment in empty beds at night when no one was there to see them except the overnight staff. The equipment was remembering, or the hospital was remembering, or something in the infrastructure of this building, in the wiring, in the network, in the walls, was holding the last healthy data of people who had died here and playing it back through whatever device was connected to the nearest empty bed. The number of phantoms is increasing. When I first noticed the phenomenon in March, there was 1. By April, there were 9. As of yesterday, May 8th, there are 23. 23 empty beds across the hospital, showing stable vital signs of patients who are not there. Each set of vitals matches the admission data of a specific former patient who died in this hospital. Louisa and I have confirmed 14 of the 23 matches. The other 9 require deeper archive searches that we haven't completed yet. The phantoms occupy empty beds and relocate when the beds are filled with real patients. They follow sleep-wake cycles. They exhibit the 2:47 a.m. event every night, all vitals declining to 0 and then returning to baseline within 3 minutes. They are not causing any clinical errors because the nursing staff knows to ignore them, and the data is not connected to any active patient chart in the EMR. But the alarms are becoming a problem. When the phantoms go through their nightly decline, every monitor displaying phantom data alarms simultaneously. Last night at 2:31 a.m., 23 monitors across 7 units began alarming with critical cardiac alerts. The sound was audible from the hallways. Nurses had to silence alarms on beds they knew were empty while also monitoring their real patients. Rachel Dow filed a formal complaint. 2 other charged nurses filed complaints. The night nursing supervisor asked Tom to disable the alarms on empty beds. Tom asked me if that was possible. I told him the alarms are tied to the monitoring thresholds and can be adjusted per bed. But that disabling critical alarms on any bed in the hospital is a Joint Commission violation and could jeopardize the hospital's accreditation. You cannot turn off a cardiac arrest alarm. The alarm exists to save lives. It cannot be disabled because a regulatory body has determined that a silent cardiac arrest alarm is an unacceptable risk. The fact that the bed is empty doesn't change the regulation. The alarm must function. So, every night at 2:31 a.m., 23 monitors alarm. The nurses silence them. At 2:47, the flat lines appear. At 2:50, the vitals return. The nurses have incorporated this into their routine the way they incorporate anything into their routine. Medication passes, shift changes, hourly rounds. The 2:47 event is now part of the nightly workflow. They call it the code, as in, did you silence the code yet? Or, the code is running late tonight. It's become normal. It shouldn't be normal. 23 dead patients, vital signs displaying on empty beds every night and dying at the same time and coming back at the same time should not be normal. But it is, because hospitals normalize everything that doesn't directly harm a living patient. And this doesn't. It just alarms. It just wakes up the nurses. It just fills the silence of the overnight shift with the sound of 23 cardiac arrest alerts that no one responds to. Because there's no one to respond to. Except that 3 nights ago, on May 5th, something happened that changed the nature of the problem. A new phantom appeared on bed 11 of the long-term care ward, which is on the 2nd floor of the original building. This is the oldest part of the hospital. The 1953 construction, lower ceilings, narrower corridors, smaller rooms. The long-term care ward is where patients go who aren't expected to recover. It's quiet in a way that other wards aren't. The monitors there are older models, Philips and Teleview MP50s, a previous generation, and the beds are the kind that have been in service for a long time. The phantom on bed 11 showed vitals I hadn't seen before. Heart rate 58, blood pressure 100/264, respiration 10, SPEO 296, lower than the others, slower, like someone very old or very tired. I looked up the historical data for bed 11. The most recent death was in January 2024, a 91-year-old woman who had been on the ward for 14 months. Her admission vitals matched the phantom, 58, 102/64, 1096. But that's not what changed things. What changed things was the temperature alarm. At 3:15 a.m., the phantom on bed 11 triggered a temperature alert. The monitor displayed a body temperature of 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below the normal range and triggers a hypothermia flag. The thing is, the temperature channel on a patient monitor requires a connected probe, a thermistor that sits under the tongue or in the axilla or in the esophagus, making physical contact with the patient's tissue. The temperature probe on bed 11 was lying on the mattress, connected to the monitor, but not to a patient, and the monitor was reading 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit from a probe touching a mattress surface. I picked up the probe. It was cold, not room temperature cold. Cold. I held it in my hand and it felt like holding a piece of metal that had been in a refrigerator. The room temperature was 68 degrees. The probe should have been 68 degrees. It was not. I looked at the monitor. The temperature reading climbed as I held the probe. 96.4, 96.6, 96.8. Warming from my hand. I put it back on the mattress. It began to cool. 96.5, 96.3, 96.1, 95.8. The probe was cooling below room temperature while lying on a mattress in a 68-degree room. That is physically impossible unless something colder than the room was in contact with the probe. Something was in the bed. I put my hand on the mattress next to the probe. The mattress was cold. Not room temperature, not that side of the bed cold. Cold the way skin is cold when circulation is poor. I moved my hand across the surface. There was an area of cold on the mattress, roughly the size and shape of a human torso, centered on the bed as if someone were lying there. The cold was most intense at the center and diminished toward the edges. I held my hand about 6 inches above the cold area. The air was colder there too, a column of cold air rising from the surface of the mattress in the shape of a body. I did not see anyone in the bed. I want to be clear about that. The bed was visibly empty. The sheets were flat, the pillow was undented, there was nothing visible. But the temperature probe was reading 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit. The mattress was cold in the shape of a person. The air above the bed was cold in the shape of a person. And the monitor was displaying the admission vitals of a 91-year-old woman who had died in this bed 4 months ago. I called Louisa. She came. She put her hand on the mattress and felt the cold. She held a thermometer above the bed and measured the air. 61 degrees, 7 degrees below room temperature, concentrated in an area roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. She put the thermometer above the next bed, bed 12, 68 degrees. Normal? She put it back above bed 11, 61 degrees. She moved it slowly up from the mattress surface. The cold extended about 18 inches above the bed and then dissipated. Whatever was generating the cold was on or very near the mattress surface. We stood there, Louisa and I, at 3:30 in the morning, in a long-term care ward, holding thermometers above an empty bed that was cold in the shape of a person whose monitors said was alive. Louisa said very quietly that she thought we should check the other phantom beds. We did. We spent the next 2 hours going unit to unit, ward to ward, checking every empty bed that was displaying phantom vitals. Not all of them were cold, but 11 of the 23 were. 11 beds, across 5 units, had localized cold areas on the mattress surface in shapes consistent with human bodies, had temperatures consistent with poor peripheral circulation. 11 beds where the equipment said someone was there, and the temperature said something was there, and our eyes said nothing was there. I haven't told Tom about the temperature findings. I'm not sure how to. The work order system doesn't have a category for empty bed is cold in the shape of a dead patient. The equipment is functioning correctly. The temperature probes are detecting real cold. The monitors are displaying real data. The alarms are responding to real threshold violations. Everything is working exactly as designed. The machines are doing their jobs. They are monitoring patients. The patients just happen to be dead. Last night, May 7th, the 2:47 event happened as usual. 23 monitors alarmed. The nurses silenced them. The flat lines came. The vitals returned, but this time, when the vitals returned to bed 11 on long-term care, the heart rate didn't go back to 58. It came back at 54, and the SPO2 came back at 95 instead of 96, and the blood pressure came back at 98/60ths instead of 102/64ths. The numbers were worse, not by a lot, by a small clinically meaningful amount that, in a living patient, would indicate a slow decline. The kind of decline you see over days and weeks in a long-term care patient who is gradually losing ground. The patient in bed 11, the phantom, the dead woman, the cold shape on the mattress, was getting sicker. I checked the other phantoms. Most had returned to their normal baselines, but 3 others, all on the long-term care ward, had also come back slightly worse. Heart rates a little slower, blood pressures a little lower, oxygen saturations down by a point. 4 phantoms, all on the oldest ward, all declining. The equipment is tracking a deterioration in patients who have been dead for months or years. The monitors are doing what they're designed to do: detect changes, track trends, alert clinicians when the trajectory is heading toward a bad outcome. The trajectory for 4 of the phantoms is heading toward a bad outcome. I don't know what happens when a phantom's vitals reach 0 and don't come back. I don't know what a monitor displays when a patient who is already dead dies again. I don't know what the nurses will do when the 2:47 event happens and 4 of the flat lines don't resolve. I don't know whether the cold areas on those beds will get colder, or if the shapes will change, or if the mattress will eventually show something I can see. I don't know what happens next. What I know is this: the equipment is working correctly. Every diagnostic confirms it. Every engineer who has examined the systems says they're functioning within specifications. The monitors are detecting real signals. The temperature probes are measuring real cold. The alarms are triggering on real threshold violations. The machines are not malfunctioning. They were built to find patients and monitor their condition. And that is exactly what they are doing. They are finding patients in empty beds and monitoring their condition. And the condition of some of those patients is deteriorating. And the correct clinical response to a deteriorating patient is intervention. And no one can intervene because no one can see the patients, and no one can touch the patients, and no one is willing to treat a set of numbers on a screen attached to an empty bed. Every night I walk these wards, and I calibrate these monitors, and I watch 23 sets of vital signs that belong to dead people, and 4 of those people are dying again. And I am the technician responsible for the equipment that is telling me this. And the equipment is right. And I don't know what to do when the equipment is right. I was trained to trust the machines. I was trained to fix them when they're broken and trust them when they're working. They're working. They've never worked better. And what they're picking up is something I cannot fix, and cannot silence, and cannot explain, and cannot stop watching. Because the numbers are real, and the cold is real, and at 2:47 a.m. every night, the alarms go off, and the flat lines come, and the nurses look at empty beds and wait for the vitals to return. And last night on bed 11, the heart rate took 9 seconds longer to come back than it did the night before. And I counted every one of those seconds, and I will count them again tonight.